I'm an American Australian. Back in America, I worked often in African American communities doing theater. The concept of white privilege has always made complete sense to me. To understand historical perspective. I don't take it personally. I take it as factual history. I know that unearned advantage has helped me and protected me. But the term white privilege is now emotionally loaded, and I would really love to hear your comments about that whole concept of white privilege.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd love to talk more to you later about your perspective as an Australian American, because I joked a minute ago that I'm an American, and that's why I won't be pledging allegiance to the King. I am in fact a dual citizen. I am American British legally, but not emotionally. And well, because I wanted to vote. That's why I became a British citizen. I lived there, and I was paying taxes, and I decided I wasn't going to disenfranchise myself. So it was a political decision, but not an emotive one. And we have these emotive relationships to our own histories and to our own identities. They become they become very fraught when people start to feel that something that they identify themselves around is being threatened or attacked in some way. And white privilege as a way of trying to identify, as you say, I think your phrase is a really good one, to identify unearned advantages that have benefited people. I think it's become problematic partly because, as we were just saying, there are so many people struggling in a cost of living crisis in the US, in the UK, who don't feel that unearned advantage. And so when they are told that they are the beneficiaries of something called white privilege, and they look around them and they see that they can't put food in their children's mouths and that they can't send their kids to university, they're not sure what this white privilege thing is, and it makes them really angry. And one can understand that. But one can also understand the historical legacies that you're talking about, and the ways in which, when we talk about individual experience and then broad social generalizations that we sometimes have to make when we talk about the way that groups have operated across history. And so for me, it's really a question about trying actually to be less emotive about history, to make a distinction between our ideas about memory and identity, which can be very personal and community-based and family-based, and then a history that tries to be more dispassionate, that tries to make the kinds of observations that you're making, that says, look, on the whole, the fact is in the US and in the UK and in Australia, white people generally benefited from systems that generally disadvantaged non-white people. That is a fact, regardless of how individuals may feel about that history. And it's a demonstrable fact, as you say. It is actually beyond argument. So I think that what we need to do is to think about history the way that we try to talk about our politics today, which is to try to be more inclusive, to try to listen to other perspectives, and to stop to stop seeing it as something that we have to protect or safeguard or to get threatened about, to say, look, history happened, how can we do better? We just need to try to do better, and history is all that we have to learn from. So instead of getting upset about it, we need to pay attention to each other and try to create a history that includes multiple perspectives and recognizes the ways that the present is a legacy of all of those past choices.
Anthony, let me bring you in on this point. Is white privilege a reality?
Okay, I think it's greatly exaggerated. It's a reality, and I'm talking about the Australian experience. Certainly here, in the context of Aboriginal Australians, it's greatly exaggerated. It's just become something to talk about endlessly, when in actual fact we know that we have, and yes, I acknowledge history, and I've seen many Indigenous Australians in this country demonstrate that they're not victims of the past or the history, but only victims of their view of the past or the history, because we have many, many, many successful Indigenous Australians. One of them often sits in that seat there, but not tonight. And there's many more like him. So yes, I don't discount it, but we shouldn't make it bigger than what it actually is, because if we do, it then becomes a disincentive for some Indigenous people to do something. They think, oh, well, no use doing anything, white privilege is against me.
But when you
in fact, I've seen many people in universities and elsewhere with black privilege here in Australia. You know, they can shut down a conversation immediately just by saying, I'm offended. So.
Yeah, but when you look at the Close the Gap
Keep
targets...
the applause going.
When you look at the annual Close the Gap targets, for example, and
Yep.
the lack of progress, the big gap between Indigenous, non-Indigenous outcomes on health, on life expectancy, education, what do you put that down to?
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, we shouldn't just assume that the gap is caused by due to racism or white privilege.
No, but what do you put it down to?
There's many factors. So location, remoteness, and just today I've watched this clip many times between you and Stan from 8 years ago, where he spoke about in remote areas we have some tough questions to answer, where we've got to seriously consider a sensitive exit strategy for them. So I'm not saying close down remote communities, and I'm not saying that cities are the great utopia, but I'm just saying in some remote communities we need to seriously consider a sensitive exit strategy such that they can have the sorts of opportunities that you and I have.
But that disadvantage isn't just in remote communities, is it?
Yeah, no, but more often than not, that's where you get a lot of it, in remoteness, where they don't have access to doctors, libraries, gyms, and fresh food.
Well, I've got to ask, would it help to have an Indigenous voice that can advise Parliament and government on ways to address that?
I don't think so, because what I've just said, we all know, and we know that without this voice. Now, just one final thing on the gap. I think we should be more focused on what I call the within or the internal gap, and that is the gap between not Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but the gap between those Indigenous people who are really suffering and those Indigenous people who are doing very, very well. If you close that gap, you will automatically close the other gap, because there are many Indigenous Australians who are doing very, very well, and they're successful. We want to replicate that success.
Sarah, let me come back to you. You've written a book about Gone with the Wind, the classic novel and film. Tell us about your thesis about how this classic story has influenced the America we see today.
Well, basically, what I think it does for people who are familiar with the story, it captures, which doesn't mean that it creates or that it produces, but it reflects and captures one other aspect of white experience that is certainly, I think, shaping American politics today, which is what I call the myth of white grievance, which is the idea that white people are the victims in the story of American history, and that happens when any attempt to balance an inequality, that when one has the sense that power is being taken away, then one feels victimized by that. And I think we're seeing a resurgence of that attitude in many of the people who voted for Trump, and now what we're calling kind of Trumpism, Trump-style politics of grievance, that says these people are coming after my life, they're coming after my way of life, instead of just saying these people also want to be able to be free to live their lives, and it may be in different ways from the way that I live mine. And it's a 400-page book, so I can't very well
capture it all tonight.
Exactly capture it all tonight. But basically, it's about the ways in which the attitudes and the emotions and the fantasies and the lies, and I say lies deliberately because they're lies about American history. They were very deliberate lies that were told in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War about why it was fought, how it was fought, what happened, and those lies shaped then a century and a half of American politics and culture. So most of all, it's really about what happens when you have a society that's in denial about its own history, and the dangers of trying to live in what, when Trump was in office, people use that phrase alternate reality, and they said, Trump has so successfully created this kind of alternate reality in the United States, and how did he do it so fast and so easily? When you actually look back at the American attitudes to the Civil War and its aftermath, we've been in an alternate reality for 160 years.